Welcome to the UN Brief. I'm your host, Maya Plentz. Today we interviewed Tim Elgelhardt. He is with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, where he works on issues related to privacy, fundamental rights, and emerging technologies, in particular, artificial intelligence. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe. It's my great pleasure to have Tim Elgelhardt from the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights speaking with us with the UN Brief. We are going to address some of the issues in your latest reports. Thank you very much, Tim, for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me.
So in this report's findings, what role does the right to privacy play in the age of AI?
Well, privacy is a fundamental human rights. Privacy is essential for people's development. It gives them space to form opinions. It gives them space to build relationships to other people. Privacy is essential for forming an identity, for determining who you are. And informational privacy, which is the information, the data that are collected about you, the data that exist, that are being used about you, protecting this informational privacy is obviously a particularly essential dimension of the protection of privacy in the digital age. But there's more to privacy, and that's something that the report of the High Commissioner makes very, very clear. The right to privacy is a gateway for the enjoyment of many, many other human rights. It's a precondition for the enjoyment of other rights, be it the right to freedom of expression. Because if you feel surveyed, you may not say what you actually want to say. You may not seek the information you want to find about your sexuality if you're in a country where certain expressions of sexuality are criminalized. Privacy, especially now in an AI age, becomes ever more important for protecting, say, rights like the right to health. If, say, surveillance may interfere with you finding information about certain health conditions, which then effectively may affect if you get health insurance. So we have all these interlinked effects of privacy and how it protects other rights. So this is a key message that should come out of this report, and that we all keep in mind when we speak about AI. In the report, the High Commissioner highlights a number of features that are linked to AI systems that have particular impacts on the exercise of privacy and human rights.
Like what?
So first of all,
give us a few examples.
Yeah. First of all, machine learning is highly data intensive, right? We see it in our everyday life when we speak about the curation of content on social media. That's based on a massive collection of data about people, about their behavior. So we have this ecosystem of data that's being collected, that's being shared, that's being brokered across platforms between data brokers, etc. And the need for large amounts of data, of course, incentivizes that. So we have this circle that creates that with very obvious implications for privacy. Then we have the power of AI systems to infer what personal traits or forecast behavior of people.
But that's the challenge too, right? Because as we're seeing, for instance, with facial recognition, you know, because the input, the design of the systems were based on some sort of pseudoscience, saying that if you look a certain way or if you smile a certain way, it means that you think about certain things that way or this way, right? Which is absurd, because most people who are really working on artificial intelligence issues understand that it's completely flawed. So that is one of the issues there, right, with facial recognition systems, is that they are based on faulty, already flawed or false or what you say, pseudoscience. So that is already a big problem right there, right? And then you'd say, okay, for law enforcement purposes, perhaps it could be useful in a big stadium, you know, in order to prevent terrorist attacks. Yes, but then how are these designed? So not
yes and no. Facial recognition as such has made impressive progress over the last few years, and that in itself is a problem, because it's a technology that lends itself so easily to abuse, to monitoring of large amounts of entire populations of not just criminals, who, by the way, still have human rights, but everyone, and we see this abuse. So we need to distinguish a number of issues. The accuracy, which is indeed a problem still. You have error rates in facial recognition systems, and linked to that, the problem that it's been shown many times that facial recognition systems tend to perform far less good when applied to women and people of color. Whereas if it's women of people of color. So if you use that for law enforcement purposes, it's obvious where this can end, with wrongful arrests, maybe wrongful...
As we have seen already in the US or several other places.
Yeah. And then we have other systems that can be built or are being built on top of facial recognition, so-called emotion recognition, which indeed has, let me put it politely, an extremely shaky scientific basis. Or more bluntly, there are studies that show that there is no proper correlation between if a person smiles and or not and their emotional state. Which leaves aside the question when or if at all the state should be enabled to look into someone's emotional state in an automated fashion, right? That touches heavily upon what we call human dignity. And if you can be just exposed to these forms of interrogation. Another problem in the context of AI is, we briefly referred to discrimination. AI scales. To explain what I mean is, you often hear, well, what's the problem with bias in AI systems? People are biased too, right? And yes, superficially, that's true. But if one law enforcement officer is biased, it's one thing. If you build a system that's being used by 50,000 law enforcement officers and the system is biased, that affects everyone, and that affects entire populations. So making a tiny mistake in one place really scales enormously. And that's where one of the huge problems lies, right? And why it's so important to get it right, to build in the safeguards, or also sometimes to draw a red line, to say, no, we can't do that, at least not now. And that's something the report says clearly. Yeah.
Right. That is something that also was very much appreciated in the academic community when the High Commissioner Bachelet actually said that, right? Let's ask for a moratorium, you know, stop using these systems until we really have in place the safeguards, or we have examined exactly how they are operating and what purposes are they serving, right? Which I thought was brilliant. That should come. It's a bold statement, right? She cannot go to the companies and tell them stop using it, but still that she comes out and says that, you know, to the international community, perhaps that will be the beginning of taking these warnings seriously.
Yes, let me make one thing very clear. AI applications can have and are having huge positive impacts in a huge range of sectors these days, right? The economic benefits for companies are clearly there. The potential for improving health outcomes, clearly there, I can say, and we have lots of negative examples too, where it simply didn't work as expected. But I want to make this clear. It's this technology is amazing and can be so amazing. But we have many instances where it's the opposite, where maybe the promise being made is great, but the reality is a very different one. And so what's important from the report is indeed one of these messages of drawing red lines, although it is in the end not a surprising one, right? When we apply the human rights framework and ask ourselves, is what we're doing a limitation of someone's right? And say, yes, well, is it justified? Is it necessary for a legitimate purpose? And is it proportionate? Then we come quite naturally to such a conclusion at some point, in some cases. If, say, you inquire, does this proposed AI solution actually, can it achieve the goal we are trying to achieve? And it turns out, maybe not, or actually rather not. We've seen that just now in the COVID-19 crisis, where studies have shown that hundreds of clinical applications were not fit for purpose. And I don't want to blame anyone who did it, because they all tried their best, right? But the availability of reliable data, for example, was just not there. So things could not work. If you transpose this to other contexts, there would be a case where you would say, okay, it's just not fit for purpose, let's drop it. Or if something may be able to achieve something, but the human rights costs are just so enormous that we think we should not go ahead. Well, that's what we call then a ban, or where the effects are not clear yet, or we need to build certain safeguards into the systems. Then let's wait and create the laws we need and create the oversight bodies we need and make the studies about the disproportionate impacts on minorities, on LGBTIQ people, on women. Because we have a limited time here, we're a little abstract in these things. But what I'm trying to say is, these conclusions flow naturally from the application of our fundamental principles.
So what solutions does the report propose?
This is the most important part and the most difficult part of the work. And I would never claim that we have all the solutions. We face here multifaceted problems, and that requires multifaceted solutions. There's no single golden bullet, right? The solution can't be to say, well, we don't use any of this. And the solution can't be, let's just go for it and work it out later. But what's important to me here is to emphasize protecting human rights, protecting privacy isn't hostile to innovation. It doesn't hinder innovation. Like innovation that undermines human rights is not innovation we need, right? This is not good innovation.
That's not innovation. It's like I would like to say, people say in Silicon Valley, oh, we are disruptors, we're innovators. And I say, no, you don't have a woman in your team. You are not innovating anything.
Yeah,
innovation that doesn't include half of the world's population. Who are you innovating for, right?
For example, or I want to add one point. It's especially in the privacy context and privacy and AI context. You hear this argument quite often. Oh, there's too much protection. That is just too costly. That will just kill innovation. When you think about the roots of what we have now as data protection or data privacy frameworks, that all started in the 1960s, 1970s. And it was born out of concerns about the growing power of computers back then. So what has happened ever since? Computers really have taken over our world and we can't live without them anymore. But their powers have just exploded, right? And the conclusion can't be, oh, well, then we just give up. No, we need maybe updated protections, but we need them. So one element the report highlights are the fundamental principles we just discussed already. The red lines, the need for robust and adaptive regulation and legislation. There's the data privacy part, which requires proper oversight, good resources, enforcement powers, etc. But there's a need for other forms of legislation too. And the higher the risks for human rights, the more robust these frameworks need to be. And the report points to some areas where this is particularly important: law enforcement, social security, employment, health, where the stakes are particularly high for the individuals that are affected, right? You don't want to put anyone in jail for no good reason. Health data is highly sensitive and highly personal, etc. So legislation that takes a risk proportionate approach appears to us something that should be taken. The report also highlights the immense lack of transparency we have surrounding AI systems. And that's something that needs to be tackled. And transparency means here various things. One is the mere fact that an AI system informs or makes decisions that affect people's rights. States and businesses should make this clear, should inform the individuals in public. Some states have started having registers for AI systems they use for their public services. But it goes further. There's the opaque data environment we see online and in other aspects, where individuals have no chance of knowing what happens to their data, what kind of data will maybe train an AI system, and what profiles are compiled about. That needs to change. And the efforts to tackle the so-called black box problem, where machine learning systems are only to a certain degree explainable or interpretable, need to be further supported. There's amazing work going out there, lots of researchers doing fantastic work that needs to be reinforced, and states should give proper funding.
And there should be investments made, right? In the
exactly.
Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is one. But we see, because the companies, largely the problem with Facebook is that it has 90% of its user base outside of the US, and they were investing very little in content moderation in the countries that were largely affected by, the amplification that the social media platform allowed, right? So the question of resources allocation within the social media companies that are employing AI, as well as the government bodies and the United Nations agencies, it is crucial, right? We need to invest on that. We cannot not invest on capacity building. And so what are the next steps you see happening in terms of, the impact of the report and this momentum we are seeing, thanks to the Senate, the American Congress actually bringing Facebook to the fry, to decide to discuss these issues. And of course, UNESCO as well this week, as you know, in this coming 3 weeks, it's the General Assembly taking place in Paris, and they are going to be, deciding on a document that will be, precisely looking at the issues of artificial intelligence and its impact on information.
Oh, yeah, the next steps. Let me start with what we're doing here in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, and then expand the angle a little bit. So first of all, in September, the Human Rights Council adopted a new resolutions on the right to privacy, and asked the High Commissioner to draft a new report on trends and challenges on the right to privacy that will be presented next year in September. That will certainly be an opportunity to delve a bit deeper into some of the issues. Then I mentioned already the resolution. The last resolution took on board various observations and recommendations from the report, and hopefully that will then inspire the negotiations next year at the General Assembly of the forthcoming resolution. So developing the discussion around the right to privacy in the digital age, step by step. You mentioned the work at UNESCO, which we obviously follow very closely. And it's very encouraging to see that over time, the human rights basis in the recommendation that's being discussed has been strengthened. Mm-hmm. We have an interagency working group on AI, in fact, at the United Nations, and we're collaborating there on developing shared projects and developing additional guidance. We have at the Human Rights Office a project on human rights due diligence. The report, in fact, has a whole section on human rights due diligence because it is an essential tool for assessing, preventing, and mitigating adverse impacts on human rights, to carry out human rights due diligence throughout the life cycle of AI systems, from its inception throughout its operation until it ends. And the Secretary General has asked us to develop system-wide guidance on human rights due diligence for the UN system, and we're in the process of doing that.
What does it mean, the due diligence process specifically?
It's a concept that's fairly familiar for people in the business and human rights world. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights put the responsibility on businesses to carry out human rights due diligence in their operations. And the concept as such is one that states should apply to, like systematically assess the risks and potential and actual adverse impacts on human rights and take the right measures. And there's not one toolbox to say, okay, you just use this checklist and then you're fine, right? This is a holistic, comprehensive process. It's a mindset in the end. You need to change, if necessary, the way you operate. It implies assessing the risks, taking the measures, monitoring the impacts throughout your operations. And it's crucial that there's meaningful, robust outreach, consultation to affected communities, to affected stakeholders, to academics, to take it on board. And remedies, if harm is being done, play an essential role there too. And a last aspect of what next steps need to be taken or are being taken is something you alluded to already. What's happening in member states? What kind of regulation is being discussed? You refer to the United States. Within the EU, we have various efforts. The Digital Services Act, where we speak about social media platforms and how to regulate them. Currently, the EU also discusses its Artificial Intelligence Act, which takes a largely risk proportionate approach, would ban a number of AI applications. So there are some similarities to our thinking there. And these are developments we follow very closely. Just 1 or 2 weeks after the privacy report was presented at the Human Rights Council, the European Parliament, in fact, adopted a resolution on the use of AI in law enforcement and criminal justice, which comes to very similar conclusions as our report. And we see, of course, how we can reinforce some of our conclusions and messages.
Very well. Thank you so much. Pleasure speaking.
My
Tim
pleasure.
Elgelhardt from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe,